right, there was a request for me to do a video on digital voltmeters, and there are obviously many models out there from many companies, and so some of the things I'm going to say are universally true, like about voltage and amperage. Other things are true for this meter, and so you're going to have to apply some discretion in determining how much of what I say applies to the meter that's in your hand or the meter that you may be buying. And so you need to take on that responsibility for yourself and keep yourself safe. All right, on this particular meter, I have 4 ports, as you can see. These are the 2 main ones. Black is COM for common. This is pretty much always used. And then this one is for reading temperature, voltage, ohms, diodes, and RPM, since this is an automotive meter and it has a couple features that are sort of specific to working on engines. This is for taking amperage measurements, and this is for taking milliamp and microamp measurements. And you will notice that there are fuses in here. So there are 2 fuses in here which can blow. I actually just blew one in preparation for this video because I very rarely take amperage measurements, and I forgot and I hooked up the meter incorrectly. But if you're hooked up to these 2, which you will be most of the time, you can flip it to alternating volts or direct volts, and you'll see that in the little icon there, alternating and direct. And then these yellow features come in when you hit the secondary button, which we won't be doing. Okay, so the first thing I want to tell you is that when you are in either of these 2 voltage modes, you can put these leads anywhere you want and you won't get hurt. You can clip these to the battery, you can shove these in a wall socket, and as long as you don't put this, as long as these don't touch, like if you touch that to the negative battery post and this to the positive and then you somehow bridge it, well, that's a short, and that's obviously going to cause some problems. But you can feel safe with these alligator styles or the probes. You can basically put those anywhere you want if you're in voltage mode, and you won't get hurt, you won't get sparks, you won't damage anything. The reason for that is because inside the meter is a massive resistor. And so even though there might be 1,000 amps in your battery, when you hook this thing up, you don't get 1,000 amps out of the battery because of the massive resistor. Now that is not true for the other modes. And so I'm not gonna go into those other modes right now. I wanna kind of keep this simple, but I wanna show you maybe 3 simple ways that you might use, 2 or 3 simple ways that you might use this meter. So the first thing is we're gonna look at the battery. And the first thing that I wanna show you is that batteries cannot electrocute you, okay? That's because these are 12 volts. And you should think of volts like you think of the pressure in your tires. 1,000,000 PSI water jet will cut you in half, but a 5 PSI garden hose will not. You need a high voltage and or electric pressure, if you will, to penetrate your skin. Just like a garden hose doesn't get underneath your skin, but a pressure washer could cut you, it's the same here. There's something around 30 to 40 DC volts before you start having, before your body becomes a conductor. Now, if I were to lay this ring from here to here, if it were bigger, or if I were to lay a wrench here, then that would be a totally different scenario, because metal conducts way better than the human body. The human body can conduct under some circumstances, but not under these. So this is totally safe to touch. So we hook up our negative and we hook up our positive, and we get 12.4. Now, if you did this wrong, you did it backward, doesn't matter, just get a negative. And if you know that, and the negative or the positive doesn't matter for what you're testing, then you don't have to be super conscientious about how you hook these up. Okay, so you have 12.5 volts. Now, the reason that you have 12.6 is the number that always is associated with 12 volt batteries. And that's because there are 6 2.1 volt battery packs in there. So you get 2.1 and you multiply it 6 times, you get 12.6. So that's why 12.6 is the number you always hear. Now 12.47 is totally fine in this case, and it will probably start the vehicle. Now, this is not a very helpful test. If this said 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 volts, then it would tell me there's something wrong. But just because it says 12 doesn't mean that everything is hunky-dory. And the reason for that is because there's no load on the system right now. Basically, the battery is not being asked to do anything. It's just sitting there. And so it's a little bit like sticking your thumb over the end of the garden hose and somebody turning it on. You can feel the pressure there, but there's no flow. You're just feeling that pressure, and you can feel that pressure, and that can be good and tell you, okay, there's some pressure at the end of the hose, but it doesn't give you a good indication of if you take your thumb off of that hose, if it's going to keep spewing out of the garden hose or if that's all it had. So one thing you'd want to do is look at the voltage while you crank the vehicle. Now you can do that with two people, or you can do that if you have a feature like MinMax. So if you hit MinMax, it's now going to keep track of the minimum and the maximum and the average voltage during the test. So let's go and start this thing real quick. So we'll just crank it real quick and shut it off again. Okay, now we go back. So we dropped a little bit of voltage, which is totally fine. Then when we hit MinMax, our max was 13.1. So that means as soon as it started, the alternator already started to give us some juice. And our minimum was 9.85. Now, you may ask, what is an appropriate minimum when you're starting an engine? Honestly, I don't have a perfect answer for you. It depends on how fully charged your battery was. So if your battery was totally full, that's different than if your battery was at 80%. And that doesn't mean your battery was bad if you started at 80%. It also depends on the temperature, depends on the motor. So what I will say is if you have one of these, this is basically, there's basically a heating element in here. And when you push this button, you heat this thing up in a very serious way, and it pulls a bunch of amps, and it is designed to test a battery. So we'll do that real quick. These are pretty useful. They're a good indication of what's going on. Now you hear the meter clicking, that's because I took this off, and that's because I have a new minimum. It's saying you have a new minimum. Okay, so we'll hook this up real quick. Sorry, folks. I'm not real organized with just one hand. Okay. Now, you have the static measurement. So you see it's on, the needle's on the green. So that's good. Now I'm gonna hold this down, and it says right here a maximum of 10 seconds, and I'm gonna load the battery. I'm gonna ask the battery to do a bunch of work for me, and we're gonna see what it drops to. I'll just do it for 5 seconds in this case. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so that's good. And if you look at this battery capacity here in the green, you see 200 to 1,000, and it's a stepped scale. And basically what they're saying is the amount to which that drops is gonna depend on your cold cranking amps. And so if you have more cold cranking amps, we expect it to drop less. Now, here's something that's very tricky. Often you will take your battery or you'll take your car to an automotive shop like an O'Reilly's or an AutoZone, and they will do that test with you, and it will drop to the red, and they'll say, see, sir, or see, ma'am, you need a new battery. Here's the problem with that. A perfectly brand new, wonderful, good battery, which has been discharged or depleted or used, some will then fail that test. That test is only valid if the battery has been charged. It's kind of like saying you fill up your gas tank to 20 gallons, you use all but 1 gallon, and then somebody says, we're very sorry, ma'am, your gas tank can't hold more than a gallon. Well, you don't know if it can hold more than a gallon because you haven't put more than a gallon in it. So before you do a test like that, you always have to charge the battery, get it all the way up to 100, and then do that test. But if you don't have that and you just have this, an appropriate test, as I mentioned, would be to take a reading while you're cranking and see if it drops basically below 9, I would say. And if it does drop below 9, then you have to ask yourself, is my battery charged properly, or maybe have I been doing a bunch of starts and it hasn't had much time with the alternator? Okay, the last test I want to show you just today is an alternator test. You're going to hear a knocking engine. Basically, what I want to show you is that you have a 12.6 volt battery in general, and when you start the car and it starts running, the alternator should give you something in like the 13.5 volts. It may vary. It may be as high as 14.5 or even 15, or at the beginning it might just be at like 12.8. Hey, 12.8 or 12.9 as it builds up that battery, but in general, it should go above 12.6, and that gives you some indication that the alternator is working correctly. If you get nothing above 12.6, then your alternator system is probably not working in some way, shape, or form. So let's start this up. Okay, so basically there's 3 tests that I showed you today. The first is what we would call a static open circuit voltage reading. Static meaning nothing's happening. Open circuit meaning there's no closed circuit which is consuming amperage, and we measured the voltage of the battery like this. That's not super helpful, although there's nothing wrong with starting, because if that says 5 volts, you already know you have a problem. You don't have to do anything else. The second test is using a MinMax feature or a buddy. Look to see what it drops to while you're cranking. You may or may not know, the only reason you have a battery in your car is to get the car started. Once the car started, the alternator does all the work. And so the main task, the most challenging task for the battery is getting the vehicle started, and that's when you have your biggest amperage draw. And the last thing you can look at is to see if your alternator is putting anything out. The amount that it puts out is going to vary based on the state of charge of the battery, and if you have the blower motor on and the headlights on and the AC on. But in general, you want to see something like 13.5 volts. If your battery is super depleted and it barely started the motor, you might not see 13.5 right away. You might just see 12.7 or 12.8 because it's trying to build up that battery. But over time, it should get to something like 13.5, depending on what you're looking at. So, all right, I hope that was a decent introduction for someone who's not real well versed in electricity and digital volt ohm meters. Again, remember that you can't get zapped on a car unless you lay something metal across those battery posts. And if you're in voltage mode, you can't get hurt or destroy anything by probing around with these guys. So you don't have to have that fear. And I hope that was helpful. Have a great day.